That was the moment I realized the family I'd built my entire fortune to support saw me as nothing more than a liability standing between them and my millions. But what Marcus and Jennifer didn't know was that I'd spent 40 years as a forensic accountant tracking down fraud and deception, and this time I was going to use every skill I'd learned to make sure they discovered that plotting against someone who specialized in catching criminals was the biggest mistake of their pathetic lives. Before we dive into how I brought down my own family, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story of betrayal and justice resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I have another incredible story of revenge that will blow your mind. My name is Margaret Sinclair. I'm 70 years old, and I'm about to tell you how my own son and daughter-in-law, people I'd given everything to, tried to murder me for an inheritance they thought they deserved, only to discover that the woman they saw as a frail burden was actually a retired forensic investigator who had spent decades putting criminals exactly like them behind bars. Let me paint you a picture of who Marcus and Jennifer really are, because understanding their true nature is crucial to this story. Marcus Sinclair is 42 years old, drives a leased BMW 5 Series he can barely afford, lives in a 4-bedroom McMansion in Westfield Heights that's mortgaged to the hilt, and has spent the last 15 years trying to maintain a lifestyle that his middle management salary at Cloud Tech Solutions could never actually support. He's the kind of man who name-drops expensive restaurants he's visited once, wears Hugo Boss suits bought on credit cards that are maxed out, and has convinced himself that appearing successful is the same as actually being successful. Marcus works as a senior business development manager, a fancy title that essentially means he makes cold calls and attends networking events while pretending he's closing major deals. His salary is $78,000 a year, decent money for most people, but nowhere near enough to support the lifestyle he's determined to maintain. He tells people at parties that he's in tech and lets them assume he's some kind of executive, when in reality he's never written a line of code or made a strategic decision that affected anything more significant than which catered lunch to order for team meetings. Jennifer Sinclair is 38, a former real estate agent who quit working the moment she married Marcus and has spent the last decade perfecting the art of spending money she didn't earn on things she doesn't need to impress people she doesn't like. She drives a white Range Rover Evoque that costs more than most people's annual salaries, gets weekly spa treatments at Azure Day Spa that run $300 per session, and hasn't cooked a meal from scratch since their wedding because she considers kitchen work beneath her station. Jennifer's daily routine involves yoga classes at an upscale studio, lunch dates with other suburban wives who compete over designer handbags, and shopping excursions to Nordstrom and Saks where she uses credit cards linked to accounts that Marcus doesn't monitor closely enough. She posts constantly on Instagram about their blessed life, showcasing expensive dinners, weekend getaways to wine country, and luxury purchases that create the illusion of wealth while actually documenting their financial destruction. Their house in Westfield Heights is a monument to their delusions of grandeur. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a 3-car garage, and a kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that Jennifer uses primarily for reheating takeout. The mortgage payment is $4,200 a month, which consumes more than 60% of Marcus's take-home pay. Add in property taxes, insurance, and the homeowners association fees for their gated community, and their housing costs alone exceed what most families spend on everything. But the house is just the beginning of their financial nightmare. The BMW lease runs $650 a month. The Range Rover lease is $820 monthly. Jennifer's shopping habits average around $3,000 per month on clothing, shoes, accessories, and home decor that she considers investments in their image. Their credit card debt has grown to over $90,000 across 7 different cards, with minimum payments that consume another $1,800 of their monthly budget. To their social circle in the suburbs, Marcus and Jennifer appear to be living the American dream. Successful professionals with a beautiful home, luxury cars, and expensive vacations documented endlessly on social media. They attend charity galas where Jennifer wears $1,000 dresses and Marcus networks with actual successful people, hoping some of their wealth might somehow transfer to him through proximity and positive thinking. But I knew the truth about their finances because I'd been helping them out of one crisis after another for years, watching them dig themselves deeper into debt while refusing to acknowledge that their lifestyle was completely unsustainable. Over the past 5 years, I had quietly paid for Marcus's emergency dental work when his insurance wouldn't cover it, covered Jennifer's car repairs when they couldn't afford the deductible, and even helped with their mortgage payments during 2 separate months when Marcus's commissions fell short. Every time I helped them financially, I would gently suggest that they might want to consider downsizing their lifestyle or creating a realistic budget. Their responses were always the same. They were on the verge of a big breakthrough that would solve all their problems. Marcus was about to close a huge deal that would result in a massive commission. Jennifer was considering going back to real estate when, quote, the market was right. They just needed to maintain their current image until these opportunities materialized. What they really needed was a fundamental change in their values and priorities, but that kind of change would have required acknowledging that their entire adult lives had been built on illusion and denial. It was easier to take money from me and continue believing that their problems were temporary rather than systemic. You see, Marcus and Jennifer had always assumed that because I lived in a modest ranch house in Maplewood, drove a reliable Honda Civic that I'd owned for 8 years, and shopped at Target instead of Nordstrom, I must be just another struggling retiree, living on Social Security, and whatever small savings I'd managed to accumulate from my government job. They'd watched me clip coupons, buy generic brands, and mend clothes instead of replacing them, and concluded that their frugal mother-in-law was financially struggling and would probably need their support eventually. The irony was that my frugal habits weren't born from necessity. They were the result of 40 years of understanding exactly how quickly money could disappear when people made poor decisions. I had seen countless families destroy themselves financially through the same kind of lifestyle inflation that was consuming Marcus and Jennifer. I lived modestly because I understood the difference between wealth and the appearance of wealth, and because I had learned that true financial security came from accumulating assets, not accumulating debt to fund consumption. My house in Maplewood was a 3-bedroom ranch that I had purchased outright in 1987 for $68,000. It was now worth approximately $320,000, but more importantly, it represented 0 monthly housing costs beyond property taxes and insurance. I drove a Honda Civic because it was reliable, efficient, and met my transportation needs without the financial burden of a car payment. I shopped at Target because their products were perfectly adequate for my needs, and the money I saved on inflated retail markup could be invested in assets that actually grew in value. What Marcus and Jennifer never bothered to investigate, what they never asked about because they were too self-absorbed to show genuine interest in anyone else's life, was what my government job had actually involved for the past 40 years. When they introduced me to their friends at social gatherings, they would say, "This is my mother-in-law, Margaret. She worked for the government before she retired," with a tone that suggested I had been a low-level bureaucrat pushing papers in some forgettable administrative role. The reality was far different. For 4 decades, I had worked as a senior forensic accountant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in financial crimes, fraud investigation, and asset recovery. I had built cases against embezzlers, money launderers, tax evaders, and investment fraudsters. I had tracked hidden assets through labyrinthine corporate structures, uncovered sophisticated schemes designed to defraud investors and taxpayers, and provided testimony that had sent hundreds of white-collar criminals to federal prison. My expertise lay in recognizing patterns of financial deception, following money trails that criminals thought they had concealed, and building ironclad cases that could withstand the scrutiny of defense attorneys and federal judges. I had worked on cases involving everything from simple check fraud to complex international money laundering operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Over the course of my career, I had developed what colleagues called an unusual intuition for detecting when people were lying about money. I could spot financial deception in conversations, recognize the behavioral patterns that indicated hidden debt or inflated income claims, and identify the specific verbal tells that revealed when someone was being dishonest about their fiscal situation. These skills had made me exceptionally valuable to the Bureau, and they had also made me exceptionally wealthy. Federal forensic accountants, particularly those with my level of expertise and security clearance, were compensated very well. My base salary in my final years with the Bureau was $135,000 annually, but that was supplemented by overtime pay for complex cases, bonuses for successful prosecutions, and consulting fees for training new investigators. Over 40 years, my total compensation had averaged nearly $200,000 per year, all of which had been invested carefully in diversified portfolios managed by financial advisors who understood that I valued steady growth over flashy returns. More significantly, my knowledge of financial crime had taught me exactly how to build and protect wealth legally and efficiently. I understood tax strategies that most people never learned, investment opportunities that weren't marketed to general consumers, and asset protection techniques that ensured my money would be secure, regardless of economic fluctuations or legal challenges. By the time I retired at 65, my investment portfolio was worth just over $3 million. My pension from the federal government provided $68,000 annually, more than enough to cover my modest living expenses. I also owned real estate in 3 different states, rental properties that generated additional passive income while appreciating in value over time. But the crown jewel of my financial portfolio was something that Marcus and Jennifer knew nothing about: a consulting business I had established after retiring from the FBI. Sinclair Financial Investigations provided forensic accounting services to law firms, insurance companies, and corporations that needed expert analysis of complex financial cases. My reputation in the field meant that I could charge premium rates for my expertise, and my decades of experience made the work both intellectually satisfying and extremely lucrative. In the 5 years since retiring from government service, my consulting business had generated over $800,000 in additional income. Combined with my investment returns and rental property profits, my net worth had grown to just over $5 million. I was, by any reasonable measure, a wealthy woman. But Marcus and Jennifer had no idea, because they had never bothered to look beyond their own assumptions about what a retired government employee should look like. The consulting work also kept me connected to the law enforcement community that had been my professional home for 4 decades. I maintained relationships with active FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and forensic specialists who respected my expertise and valued my insights on current cases. These relationships weren't just professional. They were friendships built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. When I worked on consulting cases, I operated from a home office that Marcus and Jennifer assumed was just a spare bedroom where I kept old paperwork. In reality, it was equipped with sophisticated computer systems, secure communication equipment, and access to databases that allowed me to conduct the same kind of financial analysis that had made my government career so successful. My neighbors in Maplewood knew me as a quiet, friendly retiree who kept her yard neat and participated in community activities. They had no idea that the unassuming woman next door had spent decades hunting down some of the most sophisticated financial criminals in the world, or that her modest house contained more wealth than most of them would accumulate in their lifetimes. This dual identity, the frugal retiree that Marcus and Jennifer saw, and the accomplished professional investigator that I actually was, had been deliberate. I had learned early in my career that people revealed their true nature more readily when they underestimated you. Criminals, in particular, became careless when they assumed they were dealing with someone who couldn't understand their sophisticated schemes. The same principle applied to family relationships. By allowing Marcus and Jennifer to see me as a financially struggling retiree, I had gained insight into their true character that I never would have obtained if they had known about my wealth and expertise. Their willingness to take money from someone they believed was financially vulnerable revealed exactly who they were beneath their carefully constructed facade of success and respectability. Over the years, I had watched them make increasingly poor financial decisions while refusing to acknowledge the reality of their situation. I had seen Jennifer's shopping addiction escalate to the point where she was hiding purchases from Marcus, and I had observed Marcus's growing desperation as he realized that his career wasn't going to provide the lifestyle he felt entitled to maintain. Most importantly, I had noticed subtle changes in how they talked about my future. What had once been casual conversations about my retirement plans had evolved into more pointed discussions about my estate planning and my end-of-life wishes. They would bring up news stories about elderly people who had died without proper wills, or who had become burdens to their families due to expensive medical care. Jennifer, in particular, had begun making comments about how difficult it must be for me to maintain my house as I got older, and how much safer I would be in some kind of assisted living facility where I could receive proper care. She would mention friends whose elderly parents had made the smart decision to sell their homes and move into communities designed for seniors. These conversations always made me uncomfortable, not because I was worried about my own care, but because I recognized the pattern. I had seen it in financial crime cases where family members gradually isolated elderly victims and convinced them to make decisions that benefited the perpetrators rather than the victims themselves. Marcus and Jennifer weren't yet at the point of open manipulation, but they were clearly calculating. They were trying to determine how much money I might have, how long I might live, and what obstacles might prevent them from inheriting whatever assets I possessed. What they didn't realize was that they weren't just making casual conversation with a naive elderly woman. They were revealing their intentions to someone who had spent 4 decades analyzing exactly this kind of predatory behavior and building cases against people who exploited vulnerable victims for financial gain. Every comment about my living situation, every question about my financial planning, every suggestion about my future care was being evaluated by someone who understood the difference between genuine concern and calculated manipulation. And as their financial situation grew more desperate, their comments were becoming less subtle and more revealing. The stage was being set for a confrontation that Marcus and Jennifer thought they were engineering, but which I was actually controlling from the beginning. They believed they were manipulating a helpless elderly woman, but in reality, they were revealing their criminal intentions to someone who specialized in exactly the kind of justice they were about to receive. But what Marcus and Jennifer didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined in their wildest nightmares, was that their plan to eliminate me would lead to their own complete destruction. While they were busy calculating how much money they thought they could steal, I was quietly documenting every conversation, every veiled threat, every attempt to manipulate me into making decisions that would benefit them at my expense. You see, when you've spent 40 years building cases against criminals who think they're smarter than law enforcement, you develop certain habits. You learn to recognize predatory behavior before it fully manifests. You understand the importance of documentation and evidence preservation. And most critically, you never forget that the best defense against people who want to harm you is to ensure they face consequences so severe that they serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider similar actions. Marcus and Jennifer were about to discover that targeting a retired FBI forensic accountant wasn't just a miscalculation, it was career suicide, literal suicide for their freedom, and financial suicide for any hope they had of maintaining their pretentious lifestyle. They thought they were planning my accident, but what they were actually doing was engineering their own spectacular downfall. The beauty of their situation was that they had no idea how thoroughly they were being investigated. Every phone call they made discussing their, quote, concerns about my living situation was being recorded on equipment they didn't know existed. Every email they sent to each other about my declining health and their growing responsibilities was being preserved in digital files that would eventually become evidence in their criminal trial. More importantly, every financial transaction they made, every desperate attempt to maintain their unsustainable lifestyle, was being tracked by someone who understood exactly how to trace money flows and build comprehensive pictures of financial motivation. I knew about their credit card debt down to the penny. I knew about their hidden accounts, their undisclosed spending, and their increasingly frantic attempts to find sources of income that didn't require them to actually work for their money. What Marcus and Jennifer thought was a private family matter was actually a federal case in development. They believed they were dealing with an isolated elderly woman who had no connections or resources to protect herself. In reality, they were targeting someone whose professional network included active FBI agents, federal prosecutors, forensic specialists, and judicial officials who had worked with me for decades, and who would take a very personal interest in ensuring that anyone who tried to harm me faced the full weight of federal justice. The irony was delicious. Marcus and Jennifer were so focused on what they imagined was my modest inheritance that they had no idea they were forfeiting their own futures. They were calculating the value of a house they thought was worth maybe $200,000, and savings accounts they assumed contained perhaps $50,000 in total. They had no conception that their actions were actually targeting someone whose estate was worth over $5 million, money that could have secured their financial future if they had simply treated me with basic human decency. But greed makes people stupid, and desperation makes them reckless. Marcus and Jennifer were both greedy and desperate, which meant they were about to make mistakes that would destroy their lives so completely that they would spend the rest of their existence wondering how they could have been so catastrophically wrong about everything. They thought they understood the risks they were taking. A little planning, a tragic accident, some tears at the funeral, and then a comfortable inheritance that would solve all their financial problems. What they didn't understand was that they were risking federal charges that carried sentences of 25 years to life, forfeiture of all their assets, and destruction of any hope their children might have had for normal lives. Because that was the other thing Marcus and Jennifer hadn't considered in their calculations. They had 2 children, Emma and David, ages 16 and 14 respectively. Beautiful, intelligent kids who deserved better than parents who were willing to commit murder for money. When Marcus and Jennifer were arrested, tried, and convicted, those children would lose everything. Not just their parents, but their home, their lifestyle, their social standing, and their naive belief that their family was fundamentally decent. Emma and David had no idea that their parents were planning to murder their grandmother. They thought Marcus and Jennifer were successful, loving parents who provided them with every advantage. They attended private schools, participated in expensive extracurricular activities, and enjoyed vacations and privileges that they assumed would continue indefinitely. But when the truth about their parents' crimes became public, Emma and David would discover that everything they thought they knew about their family was a lie. They would learn that their comfortable lifestyle had been funded by debt and deception. They would realize that their parents had been willing to kill an elderly woman, their own grandmother, rather than make the lifestyle sacrifices that would have preserved their family's integrity. The children would also discover, probably through news reports or court documents, that the grandmother their parents had planned to murder was actually wealthy enough to have secured their futures if Marcus and Jennifer had simply maintained a decent relationship with her. Instead of inheriting millions that could have funded their education, supported their career development, and provided them with genuine financial security, Emma and David would inherit nothing but shame, debt, and the knowledge that their parents were convicted murderers. This was perhaps the most tragic aspect of Marcus and Jennifer's plan. They weren't just destroying their own lives. They were destroying their children's futures for the sake of money that they never would have needed if they had simply lived within their means and treated their family members with respect. But I wasn't going to let Emma and David suffer for their parents' crimes any more than absolutely necessary. While Marcus and Jennifer were planning my murder, I was planning to ensure that their children would be protected, educated, and given opportunities to build better lives than their parents had chosen. My estate planning now included provisions for Emma and David that would become active when their parents were incarcerated. The children would be placed with Jennifer's sister Sarah, a teacher in Portland who had always been appalled by Marcus and Jennifer's materialistic values and financial irresponsibility. Sarah had offered multiple times to take the children if anything ever happened to their parents, and I had already spoken with her about the possibility that something might indeed happen. Sarah understood that Emma and David would need therapy, financial support, and time to process the trauma of learning that their parents were criminals. She also understood that the children would need to develop different values than the ones Marcus and Jennifer had tried to instill, values based on character, compassion, and genuine achievement, rather than wealth, status, and material accumulation. To support this transition, I had established educational trusts for Emma and David that would pay for their therapy, their living expenses with Sarah, and their college educations. But these trusts came with conditions designed to help them develop into better people than their parents had become. The money would be available only if Emma and David chose to pursue careers focused on serving others, rather than accumulating wealth. If they wanted to become teachers, social workers, counselors, medical professionals, engineers, scientists, or other professions that contributed to society, they would have full financial support through graduate school. If they chose to pursue careers in finance, real estate, luxury sales, or other fields focused primarily on making money, they would receive minimal support and would need to fund their own education and career development. This structure was designed to encourage Emma and David to think about what kind of people they wanted to become, rather than simply assuming they were entitled to comfort and privilege regardless of their choices or character. They would have opportunities that many children never receive, but only if they demonstrated that they understood the difference between success and material accumulation. I had also arranged for Emma and David to receive letters from me explaining why their parents had been arrested and what lessons they might learn from their family's tragedy. These letters would be delivered when the children were emotionally ready to process the information, probably during their late teens or early 20s. The letters would explain that their parents hadn't been evil people, but that they had made choices based on values that ultimately led to their destruction. Marcus and Jennifer had prioritized appearance over reality, consumption over production, and immediate gratification over long-term planning. They had measured their worth by what they owned rather than what they contributed, and they had been willing to hurt other people rather than acknowledge that their lifestyle was unsustainable. But the letters would also explain that Emma and David could choose different values and build different lives. They could focus on developing skills, building relationships, and contributing to their communities rather than simply accumulating possessions. They could measure their success by the positive impact they had on other people rather than by their net worth or social status. Most importantly, the letters would emphasize that Emma and David were not responsible for their parents' choices and that they had the opportunity to create their own legacies based on their own decisions about what kind of people they wanted to become. This long-term planning for Marcus and Jennifer's children was running parallel to my short-term planning for Marcus and Jennifer's prosecution. While I was arranging for their children's future welfare, I was also documenting their criminal behavior and preparing the evidence that would ensure their conviction. The documentation process required patience and strategic thinking. I couldn't simply record one conversation and expect prosecutors to build a case around it. I needed to establish a pattern of criminal intent, demonstrate the premeditated nature of their plans, and provide evidence that would withstand the scrutiny of defense attorneys who would argue that any ambiguous statements had been misinterpreted. This meant allowing Marcus and Jennifer to continue developing their plans while I documented every step of their progression, from financial desperation to criminal intent to specific planning for my murder. It meant enduring months of increasingly uncomfortable conversations where they probed my health, my living situation, and my financial arrangements while I pretended to be the naive elderly woman they needed me to be. But the waiting was worthwhile because it allowed me to build a case that would be absolutely ironclad. By the time Marcus and Jennifer were arrested, I would have evidence of their financial motivation, their criminal planning, their specific methods, and their attempts to cover their tracks. There would be no possibility of claiming that their actions were misunderstood or that their intentions were benevolent. The evidence would also demonstrate that their crimes weren't impulsive mistakes born from temporary financial stress. The documentation would show that Marcus and Jennifer had spent months calculating, planning, and preparing to murder me for money. They had researched methods, discussed timing, and coordinated their stories for after my death. This was premeditated murder with financial motivation, exactly the kind of case that federal prosecutors loved because it demonstrated clear criminal intent and provided opportunities to pursue maximum sentences. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the evidence I was building was that it would reveal Marcus and Jennifer's true character not just to law enforcement, but to everyone who had been fooled by their carefully constructed image of success and respectability. Their wealthy neighbors in Westfield Heights would discover that the successful couple they had envied was actually deeply in debt and willing to commit murder for money. Marcus's colleagues at Cloud Tech Solutions would learn that their networking partner was a potential killer who had been planning to murder his elderly mother-in-law rather than address his financial problems through honest work. Jennifer's spa friends would realize that the woman they had assumed was financially secure was actually so desperate that she was willing to participate in murder rather than give up her luxury lifestyle. The social destruction would be almost as complete as the legal consequences. Marcus and Jennifer had built their entire adult identities around the illusion of success and respectability. When their crimes became public, that illusion would be shattered so completely that they would lose not just their freedom, but their social standing, their professional reputations, and their sense of themselves as decent people. This comprehensive destruction wasn't just a side effect of their prosecution, it was a necessary component of the justice they deserved. Marcus and Jennifer had been willing to destroy my life for their financial benefit. It was appropriate that their willingness to commit murder should result in the complete destruction of everything they had tried so hard to build and maintain. But the most important message that their prosecution would send wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. There were other elderly people in similar situations, facing family members who saw them as financial obstacles rather than human beings deserving of respect and care. When Marcus and Jennifer's case became public, it would serve as a warning to anyone else who might be considering similar crimes. The message would be clear. Targeting elderly family members for financial gain isn't just morally reprehensible, it's legally dangerous. Law enforcement takes elder abuse seriously, prosecutors pursue these cases aggressively, and the sentences are severe enough to destroy the perpetrators' lives completely. More specifically, the case would demonstrate that underestimating elderly victims based on stereotypes about age and vulnerability was a critical mistake. Some elderly people have resources, connections, and expertise that make them far more dangerous opponents than their appearance might suggest. Some elderly people have spent their careers learning exactly how to catch criminals and build cases that result in maximum sentences. Marcus and Jennifer were about to become object lessons in the dangers of assuming that age equals helplessness, that modest appearances indicate limited resources, and that family relationships provide protection from the consequences of criminal behavior. They thought they were planning my destruction, but what they were actually doing was choreographing their own downfall with a precision that would have been impressive if it weren't so tragic. Every decision they made, every conversation they had, every step they took toward implementing their plan was moving them closer to a reckoning that would destroy everything they thought they were trying to protect. And the most beautiful part of the entire situation was that they had no idea any of this was happening. They believed they were in control, that they were successfully manipulating a helpless victim, and that their plan was proceeding smoothly toward a successful conclusion. They were wrong about everything, and they were about to discover just how catastrophically wrong they had been about the woman they thought they could murder without consequences.
To understand how completely Marcus and Jennifer had misjudged their situation, you need to understand who I really am. Not the frail, financially struggling grandmother they saw, but the accomplished professional investigator who had spent 4 decades building cases against people exactly like them. Because the woman they thought they could manipulate and eliminate was actually someone who had dedicated her entire career to ensuring that criminals faced justice, and I wasn't about to make an exception just because these particular criminals happened to be family. My journey to becoming one of the FBI's most respected forensic accountants began in 1982, when I was a 27-year-old single mother struggling to support my infant son Marcus after his father abandoned us both. I had graduated from State University with a degree in accounting, but the entry-level positions available to women in the early 1980s were limited and poorly paid. I was working as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company, making barely enough money to cover rent and childcare, when everything changed because of a case of embezzlement that would redirect the entire course of my life. The company where I worked, Midwest Manufacturing, had been experiencing unexplained financial irregularities for several months. Inventory was disappearing, accounts weren't balancing, and the owner, Mr. Patterson, was becoming increasingly frustrated with his inability to understand what was happening to his business. As the bookkeeper, I was responsible for maintaining the financial records, but I kept discovering discrepancies that didn't make sense according to any normal business operations. At first, I assumed the problems were due to clerical errors or miscommunication between departments. But as I dug deeper into the records, trying to identify and correct the mistakes, I began to see patterns that suggested something more serious was happening. Money was being moved between accounts in ways that didn't correspond to actual business activities. Invoices were being created for services that had never been performed. Purchase orders were being generated for inventory that never arrived. Most telling, these irregularities always seemed to benefit one person, Robert Chen, the company's chief financial officer and Mr. Patterson's most trusted employee. Robert had been with the company for 8 years, had helped it grow from a small operation to a mid-sized business, and was considered indispensable by everyone who worked there. He was also, as I was beginning to realize, systematically stealing from the company in ways that were sophisticated enough to avoid detection by anyone who wasn't specifically looking for evidence of fraud. When I brought my concerns to Mr. Patterson, his initial reaction was skepticism and defensiveness. Robert Chen was like a son to him, a loyal employee who had worked nights and weekends to help build the business. The idea that Robert might be stealing was not just surprising. It was personally devastating to a man who prided himself on his ability to judge character and inspire loyalty. But Mr. Patterson was also a practical businessman who understood that financial irregularities needed to be investigated, regardless of who might be involved. He asked me to document everything I had discovered and to continue monitoring the accounts to see if I could identify exactly what was happening and how much money might be involved. Over the next 6 weeks, working evenings and weekends while my baby son slept, I built a comprehensive case against Robert Chen that revealed the full scope of his embezzlement. He had been stealing approximately $15,000 per month for over 2 years, using a variety of methods that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of accounting principles and business operations. Robert was creating fake vendor accounts and submitting invoices for services that had never been performed, then depositing the payments into bank accounts he controlled. He was manipulating inventory records to hide the fact that he was selling company products through side channels and keeping the profits. He was even skimming cash from customer payments by recording partial payments in the company books while depositing the full amounts into his personal accounts. The total theft was over $400,000, enough to destroy Midwest manufacturing if it continued, and enough to constitute serious federal crimes, given that the company had contracts with government agencies. When I presented my findings to Mr. Patterson, he was simultaneously grateful for my detective work and devastated by the betrayal of someone he had trusted completely. Mr. Patterson immediately contacted the FBI. And that's when I met Special Agent Linda Rodriguez, a financial crimes investigator who would become my mentor, my colleague, and eventually one of my closest friends. Agent Rodriguez was impressed by the quality of my investigation and the clarity of my documentation. She told me that my case against Robert Chen was better organized and more comprehensive than many investigations conducted by trained law enforcement professionals. Miss Sinclair, Agent Rodriguez said after reviewing my files, "You have a natural talent for this kind of work. Have you ever considered a career in law enforcement?" At the time, the idea seemed impossible. I was a single mother with a baby, working full-time just to pay rent and buy groceries. Law enforcement seemed like a career for people who had different life circumstances and different opportunities than I could ever hope to have. But Agent Rodriguez explained that the FBI was actively recruiting forensic accountants, particularly women who could bring different perspectives to financial crime investigation. She told me about training programs, educational opportunities, and career paths that I had never imagined were available to someone with my background. More importantly, she explained that my experience as a single mother, struggling financially, actually gave me insights that were valuable in financial crime investigation. I understood what financial desperation felt like, which meant I could recognize the motivations that drove people to make criminal choices. I also understood the importance of attention to detail and careful documentation, skills that were essential for building successful prosecutions. The prosecution of Robert Chen became a case study in how financial crimes should be investigated and prosecuted. My documentation was so thorough that Robert's defense attorney advised him to plead guilty rather than risk a trial where the evidence against him was overwhelming. Robert was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to Midwest Manufacturing. But the most important outcome of the case was that it launched my career with the FBI. Agent Rodriguez helped me apply for a position as a forensic accounting specialist, and I was accepted into a training program that would teach me the advanced skills I needed to investigate complex financial crimes. The FBI training was intense and comprehensive. I learned about money laundering, tax evasion, securities fraud, and dozens of other financial crimes that I had never imagined existed. I studied investigative techniques, evidence preservation, courtroom testimony, and case management. I also learned about the psychology of financial criminals, what motivated them, how they justified their actions, and what patterns of behavior made them vulnerable to detection and prosecution. But perhaps the most valuable part of my training was learning to think like a criminal in order to catch criminals. I studied successful financial crime schemes to understand how they worked, which meant I could recognize similar patterns when I encountered them in real cases. I learned to identify the subtle signs that indicated when someone was hiding assets, manipulating records, or deceiving investigators about their financial activities. This training served me well over the 4 decades that followed. I worked on cases involving everything from simple embezzlement to complex international money laundering operations. I helped prosecute tax evaders who had hidden millions of dollars in offshore accounts, investment fraudsters who had bilked elderly victims out of their life savings, and organized crime figures who had used legitimate businesses to disguise their criminal enterprises. One of my most significant cases involved a healthcare fraud scheme that had been operating for over 7 years before anyone realized what was happening. Dr. Michael Foster, a respected cardiologist in Chicago, had been billing Medicare and private insurance companies for procedures he had never performed, diagnostic tests he had never conducted, and follow-up care he had never provided. Dr. Foster's scheme was sophisticated because he understood both medical billing procedures and human psychology. He targeted elderly patients who were confused by medical billing and unlikely to question charges for cardiac care that they assumed was necessary for their health. He also bribed several medical billing clerks to process his fraudulent claims without scrutiny, creating a network of corruption that made his crimes harder to detect. The case came to my attention when a Medicare auditor noticed that Dr. Foster's billing patterns were unusual compared to other cardiologists in his area. He was performing certain expensive procedures at rates that were statistically unlikely, and his patient outcomes were inconsistent with the severity of conditions he was claiming to treat. My investigation revealed that Dr. Foster had stolen over $2 million from Medicare and private insurance companies over 7 years. But more disturbing than the financial theft was the fact that his fraudulent billing meant that elderly patients were not receiving the cardiac care they actually needed. Some of Dr. Foster's patients had suffered heart attacks or other cardiac events that might have been prevented if they had received legitimate medical care instead of billing fraud disguised as treatment. Building the case against Dr. Foster required understanding both medical procedures and financial systems. I had to learn enough about cardiology to recognize when billing codes didn't match actual medical care. And I had to trace money flows through multiple accounts to demonstrate how Dr. Foster was concealing his theft. The investigation took 18 months and involved cooperation with medical licensing boards, insurance companies, and Medicare fraud investigators. When Dr. Foster was finally arrested, the evidence against him filled 14 file boxes and included documentation of over 3,000 fraudulent billing transactions. Dr. Foster was convicted on 37 federal charges and sentenced to 12 years in prison. His medical license was permanently revoked, and he was ordered to pay full restitution to his victims. More importantly, the case led to reforms in Medicare billing oversight that helped prevent similar schemes from operating undetected in the future. The Dr. Foster case was typical of the work I did throughout my career. Complex investigations that required patience, attention to detail, and the ability to understand how criminals use legitimate systems to disguise their illegal activities. But what made my career particularly satisfying was that every case I worked on resulted in justice for victims who had been harmed by people they trusted. Whether it was elderly people bilked by investment scams, small businesses destroyed by embezzling employees, or taxpayers cheated by people who refused to pay their fair share, every case involved real people who had been hurt by criminals who thought they were too smart to get caught. My job was to prove that they weren't as smart as they thought they were, and to ensure that they faced consequences severe enough to deter other potential criminals. Over 4 decades, I worked on over 400 major cases and helped secure convictions that resulted in more than $3 billion in restitution for victims of financial crimes. But the statistics that mattered most to me weren't the dollar amounts. They were the individual victims who received justice and the criminals who learned that their actions had consequences. This experience had taught me several important lessons that were directly relevant to my current situation with Marcus and Jennifer. First, financial desperation makes people capable of crimes they never thought they would consider. Second, criminals almost always underestimate the intelligence and resources of their victims. Third, the best way to catch criminals is to let them reveal their intentions while you document everything they say and do. Most importantly, I had learned that family relationships don't provide protection from criminal prosecution when someone chooses to commit serious crimes. Over the years, I had investigated cases involving children who defrauded their elderly parents, spouses who embezzled from family businesses, and siblings who conspired to steal inheritances. Family loyalty was often used as an excuse for criminal behavior, but it was never accepted as a legal defense. Marcus and Jennifer were about to learn all of these lessons the hard way. They thought their family relationship with me provided them with both opportunity and protection. Opportunity to access my assets and protection from serious consequences if their crimes were discovered. They were wrong on both counts. My experience had also taught me that the most effective way to build a case against family members who were planning financial crimes was to appear vulnerable while actually documenting everything. Criminals became careless when they believed their victims were helpless, and family criminals were particularly prone to overconfidence because they assumed their relatives would never take action against them. This was exactly the dynamic I was creating with Marcus and Jennifer. By maintaining the appearance of being a financially struggling elderly woman who depended on their help and guidance, I was encouraging them to reveal their true intentions while I built a comprehensive case against them. But my professional experience was only part of what made me dangerous to Marcus and Jennifer. The other part was my personal commitment to justice, which had been shaped by my own experiences as a victim of financial abuse early in my life. When Marcus was born and his father abandoned us, I found myself in exactly the kind of vulnerable position that financial predators target. I was young, inexperienced with money, and desperate for help from anyone who seemed willing to provide it. This vulnerability made me susceptible to several schemes that cost me money I couldn't afford to lose, and taught me painful lessons about trusting people who had ulterior motives. The most devastating example occurred when Marcus was 2 years old, and I was struggling to pay for childcare while working full-time. A woman named Sandra Davis, who presented herself as a financial advisor specializing in helping single mothers, convinced me to invest my small savings in what she claimed was a guaranteed return program designed specifically for women in my situation. Sandra was convincing because she understood exactly what I needed to hear. She talked about the importance of financial independence for single mothers, the challenges of building wealth on a limited income, and the opportunities that were available to women who were smart enough to take advantage of them. She showed me testimonials from other single mothers who claimed to have doubled their money within 6 months of working with her. What Sandra was actually running was a Ponzi scheme that targeted vulnerable women who were too inexperienced to recognize the warning signs of investment fraud. She used money from new investors to pay returns to earlier investors, creating the illusion that her program was successful while actually stealing from everyone who trusted her. I invested $3,000 with Sandra, money I had saved over 2 years by working overtime and living on beans and rice so that Marcus could have proper food and clothing. Within 6 months, Sandra had disappeared with my money and the savings of dozens of other women who had believed her promises about financial independence and guaranteed returns. Losing that money was devastating, not just financially but emotionally. I felt stupid for believing Sandra's promises, angry at myself for not recognizing the warning signs, and terrified about how I would support Marcus without the savings that had represented my only financial security. But the experience also taught me important lessons about predatory behavior and victim psychology. I learned to recognize the techniques that criminals use to gain victims' trust, the emotional vulnerabilities they exploit, and the patterns of behavior that indicate when someone is being targeted for financial abuse. More importantly, the experience motivated me to ensure that other victims received the justice that I had never gotten. Sandra Davis was never prosecuted because she had structured her scheme carefully to avoid federal jurisdiction, and local law enforcement wasn't equipped to handle complex financial crimes. She simply disappeared with our money and probably started the same scheme in a different city with different victims. This injustice fueled my commitment to financial crime investigation throughout my career. Every case I worked on was an opportunity to provide justice for victims who had been hurt by people like Sandra Davis. Every conviction I helped secure was a small victory against the kind of predatory behavior that had cost me my life savings when I was most vulnerable. Now, Marcus and Jennifer were planning to victimize me in ways that were far worse than anything Sandra Davis had done. They weren't just trying to steal my money, they were planning to murder me. And unlike Sandra Davis, they weren't going to escape justice by disappearing to another city. They were going to face the full weight of federal prosecution, and I was going to make sure that their case served as a warning to anyone else who might consider targeting elderly family members for financial gain. My personal experience as a victim, combined with my professional experience as an investigator, made me uniquely qualified to ensure that Marcus and Jennifer received exactly the kind of justice they deserved. I understood what it felt like to be targeted by financial predators, and I knew exactly how to build cases that resulted in maximum sentences. But perhaps most importantly, I understood that allowing criminals to escape consequences only encouraged them to target additional victims. Marcus and Jennifer weren't going to stop with me if their plan succeeded. They would use their inheritance to temporarily solve their financial problems, but their fundamental character flaws and poor decision-making would eventually create new crises. When that happened, they would look for other vulnerable people to exploit, possibly including their own children, when Emma and David became adults with assets of their own. By ensuring that Marcus and Jennifer faced severe consequences for their crimes against me, I was protecting not just myself, but future victims who might otherwise be targeted by people who had learned that family relationships provided both opportunity and immunity for financial crimes. This was why I felt no guilt about the comprehensive destruction that was about to befall Marcus and Jennifer. They had made their choices, and those choices had consequences that extended far beyond their immediate family. Their prosecution would send a message that elderly abuse was a serious crime with serious penalties, regardless of who committed it or what relationships were involved. More personally, their prosecution would provide me with the same kind of justice that I had provided for hundreds of other victims throughout my career. After 40 years of ensuring that financial criminals faced appropriate consequences, I was finally going to experience that justice from the victim's perspective. And I was going to make sure that Marcus and Jennifer understood exactly who they had chosen to target and exactly what that choice was going to cost them.
To understand how my own son and daughter-in-law became capable of planning my murder, you need to understand the 15-year journey of moral decay that transformed them from struggling young adults into calculating criminals willing to kill for money. Because Marcus and Jennifer didn't start as murderers, they evolved into them through a series of increasingly unethical choices, each one making the next betrayal easier to justify, until killing me seemed like just another problem to solve, rather than the unthinkable crime it actually was. Marcus David Sinclair was born in November 1981, 3 months after his father walked out on us both. From the moment he took his first breath, it was just the two of us against the world, and I was determined that my son would have every opportunity I could provide, despite the financial struggles that defined our early years together. I worked multiple jobs, lived in cramped apartments, and sacrificed everything I could think of to ensure that Marcus grew up feeling loved, supported, and confident about his future. But somewhere along the way, my efforts to protect Marcus from the financial insecurity I had experienced created a different kind of problem. Because I worked so hard to shield him from our struggles, Marcus never learned to appreciate the value of money or understand the effort required to earn it. While I was eating ramen noodles so he could have fresh fruit and vegetables, Marcus assumed that financial security was simply the natural state of things, rather than something that had to be earned and maintained through careful planning and hard work. During his elementary school years, Marcus was a bright, curious child who excelled academically and seemed to understand that his mother was working hard to provide for him. He would help with household chores without being asked, appreciated the small luxuries I could occasionally afford, and often expressed gratitude for the opportunities I was creating for him. But as Marcus entered middle school and began comparing his lifestyle to those of his classmates, his attitude began to shift. He started noticing that other kids had newer clothes, better electronics, and more expensive toys. He began asking why we couldn't afford the same things his friends had, and why I couldn't simply buy him whatever he wanted when he wanted it. I tried to explain to Marcus that money had to be earned, and that our modest lifestyle was the result of careful budgeting and responsible spending. I attempted to teach him about saving, planning, and making thoughtful choices about purchases. But these lessons were undermined by my own behavior because I continued to prioritize his wants over my own needs, often buying him things we couldn't really afford because I wanted him to feel equal to his peers. By high school, Marcus had developed a sense of entitlement that I didn't recognize until it was too late to correct easily. He assumed that I would pay for whatever he needed or wanted, and he became increasingly resentful when financial limitations prevented him from having the same lifestyle as the wealthiest students in his class. Marcus attended Lincoln High School, a public school in a district where the student body included both working-class kids like himself and wealthy teenagers whose parents were doctors, lawyers, and business executives. This mixing of economic classes created social dynamics that were challenging for someone like Marcus, who was smart enough and charming enough to be accepted by the wealthy students but didn't have the financial resources to fully participate in their lifestyle. During his junior and senior years, Marcus began lying about our family's financial situation to maintain his social status. He would tell friends that I worked in financial services rather than explaining that I was a government accountant. He would claim that we were, quote, temporarily downsizing, rather than admitting that we had always lived modestly by necessity. Most significantly, he began making promises about future purchases and activities that he knew I couldn't afford, apparently believing that he could convince me to spend money we didn't have rather than disappoint his friends. This pattern of deception became clear to me during Marcus's senior year, when several of his friends' parents contacted me about expensive plans that Marcus had apparently committed to without consulting me. A ski trip to Colorado that would cost $800 per person. A group vacation to Mexico for spring break that would run over $1,000. A graduation party at an upscale restaurant where Marcus had apparently told his friends that I would pay for the entire group. When I confronted Marcus about these commitments, his response revealed how completely his attitude about money had changed. He was angry that I was embarrassing him by refusing to pay for activities that he had already promised his friends he could afford. He accused me of holding him back and preventing him from living his life because of my obsession with saving money. Most disturbingly, Marcus seemed genuinely confused about why I couldn't simply write checks for whatever he wanted. In his mind, my reluctance to spend money on his social activities was a choice rather than a necessity, and my explanations about budgets and financial limitations were simply excuses to avoid supporting his happiness. This disconnect between Marcus's expectations and reality became even more problematic when he started dating Jennifer Walsh during his senior year. Jennifer came from a family where money was never discussed because it was never a concern, and her lifestyle expectations were completely incompatible with our family's financial situation. Jennifer's father, Robert Walsh, owned a successful insurance agency, and her mother, Patricia Walsh, was a real estate agent who specialized in luxury properties. The Walsh family lived in a 6-bedroom house in Riverside Estates, drove luxury cars, and took elaborate vacations to Europe and the Caribbean. Jennifer had never had a job, never worried about money, and never experienced any situation where she couldn't have whatever she wanted, simply by asking her parents for it. When Marcus and Jennifer started dating, I could see immediately that this relationship was going to create problems. Jennifer was a lovely girl, polite, intelligent, and genuinely caring in many ways, but she had no understanding of financial limitations or budget constraints. She would suggest activities and purchases that seemed modest to her but were completely beyond our means, and she couldn't understand why Marcus couldn't participate in the lifestyle she took for granted. More problematically, Jennifer's presence in Marcus's life intensified his resentment about our financial situation. Being around her family made him acutely aware of everything he didn't have and couldn't afford. He began making increasingly bitter comments about my cheapness and started expressing anger that he had been stuck with a mother who couldn't provide the same lifestyle that his girlfriend's parents offered effortlessly. During the spring of Marcus's senior year, these tensions came to a head when Jennifer's parents invited Marcus to join their family for a 2-week vacation to Italy. The invitation was generous and well-intentioned, but it created a situation where Marcus would be exposed to a level of luxury that would make our normal lifestyle seem even more inadequate by comparison. I couldn't afford to send Marcus on this trip, but I also couldn't bear the thought of him missing an opportunity that might never come again. Against my better judgment, I used credit cards to cover the expenses associated with the trip, not just the airfare and spending money, but also the wardrobe upgrades that Marcus insisted were necessary to fit in with Jennifer's family. The total cost of Marcus's Italian vacation was over $4,000, money that I didn't have, and that took me 2 years to pay off. But I convinced myself that this was an investment in Marcus's future, an opportunity for him to experience different cultures and develop broader perspectives that would serve him well in college and beyond. What the trip actually did was convince Marcus that luxury travel and expensive experiences were normal parts of life, rather than special privileges that required significant financial sacrifice. When he returned from Italy, he talked constantly about the hotels they had stayed in, the restaurants they had visited, and the shopping they had done, but he never acknowledged the financial burden that his participation had placed on our family. Even worse, the trip seemed to have convinced Marcus that I had been deliberately withholding a comfortable lifestyle from him rather than genuinely struggling to provide for our basic needs. In his mind, the fact that I could afford to send him to Italy proved that I had been choosing to live modestly rather than being forced to do so by financial constraints. This fundamental misunderstanding about our financial reality would shape Marcus's attitude toward money for the rest of his life. He began to believe that financial security was simply a matter of being willing to spend money, rather than the result of earning more than you spent and saving for future needs. When Marcus left for college at State University, I was hopeful that living independently would teach him about financial responsibility and help him develop more realistic expectations about money. I was wrong. Instead, college provided Marcus with access to student loans and credit cards that allowed him to continue living beyond his means, while accumulating debt that he didn't fully understand. During his freshman year, Marcus called me regularly to complain about his limited budget and to request additional money for activities, clothes, and entertainment that he considered essential to his college experience. When I explained that I had already stretched our finances to cover his tuition and basic living expenses, Marcus would become angry and resentful, suggesting that other parents found ways to support their children more generously. The credit card companies that aggressively marketed to college students provided Marcus with what seemed like a solution to his financial limitations. By his sophomore year, he had accumulated nearly $15,000 in credit card debt, money he had spent on spring break trips, expensive electronics, dining out, and the kind of social activities that he believed were necessary to maintain his status among his peers. When Marcus finally told me about his credit card debt during his junior year, he presented it as a temporary problem that could be solved if I would simply pay off his balances and give him a quote-quote start. He seemed genuinely surprised when I explained that I didn't have $15,000 available to cover his poor spending decisions, and he was resentful that I wouldn't take out loans against my own future to solve his immediate problems. This was the moment when I realized that my efforts to provide Marcus with opportunities I had never had were actually harming his character development. By constantly sacrificing my own needs to meet his wants, I had taught him that other people's money was available to solve his problems, and that financial irresponsibility would be rescued by someone else's responsibility. But it was too late to easily correct these lessons. Marcus was already 20 years old, and his fundamental attitudes about money and responsibility had been shaped by 2 decades of experiences that had taught him to expect rather than appreciate, to demand rather than request, and to assume that others would pay the costs of his choices. During his senior year of college, Marcus met Jennifer Walsh again at a mutual friend's party, and they began the relationship that would eventually lead to marriage, and ultimately to their conspiracy to murder me for money. Jennifer had attended a private college in California, where she had studied communications with a minor in art history, a degree combination that prepared her for no particular career, but provided her with 4 years of expensive education in subjects that interested her. After graduation, Jennifer moved back to her parents' house and began working as a real estate agent, a career choice that seemed perfect for someone with her social skills and family connections. Her father's business relationships provided her with potential clients, her mother's real estate experience offered mentorship and guidance, and her family's financial security meant that she could afford to work in a commission-based field while building her client base. But Jennifer's approach to real estate was fundamentally flawed because she had never learned to distinguish between her own preferences and her clients' needs. She consistently showed properties that appealed to her personal taste rather than matching clients' stated requirements and budgets. She would become frustrated when clients couldn't afford the homes she thought they should want, and she had difficulty understanding why people made purchasing decisions based on practical considerations rather than aesthetic preferences. More significantly, Jennifer's spending habits made it impossible for her to save money, even when she was earning substantial commissions. She would celebrate every successful sale by purchasing expensive clothing, jewelry, or home decor items that consumed her earnings faster than she could generate them. During slow periods, she would use credit cards to maintain her lifestyle rather than adjusting her spending to match her reduced income. When Marcus and Jennifer reconnected during his senior year, they were both facing financial pressures that made their relationship as much about mutual financial rescue as about romantic attraction. Marcus was drowning in student loan and credit card debt, while Jennifer was struggling to establish a successful real estate career while maintaining the expensive lifestyle she had always taken for granted. Their solution was to combine their problems and hope that 2 people living beyond their means could somehow create financial stability through marriage. This mathematical impossibility was disguised by their mutual belief that their financial struggles were temporary setbacks, rather than the predictable consequences of their spending habits and career choices. Marcus graduated from college with over $40,000 in student loan debt and nearly $20,000 in credit card balances. Jennifer had accumulated approximately $15,000 in credit card debt during her first 2 years as a real estate agent. Rather than addressing these debts before marriage, they decided that combining their finances would somehow make their individual problems easier to manage. Their wedding in 2008 was itself a perfect example of their approach to financial decision-making. The ceremony and reception cost nearly $30,000, money that neither of their families could afford without taking on significant debt. Rather than planning a modest celebration that matched their actual resources, Marcus and Jennifer borrowed money to create the kind of wedding they thought they deserved, based on their self-image rather than their financial reality. I contributed $8,000 to their wedding expenses, money that I could barely afford but that I provided because I wanted Marcus to start his marriage without the additional stress of wedding debt. Jennifer's parents contributed approximately $15,000, stretching their own finances to ensure that their daughter had the kind of celebration she had always imagined. But Marcus and Jennifer supplemented these family contributions with credit card charges and personal loans that brought their total wedding debt to over $12,000. They justified this additional borrowing by telling themselves that they would pay off the debt quickly once Marcus established his career and Jennifer's real estate business became more successful. Instead, their combined debt created a financial burden that would shape their entire marriage. Rather than learning to live within their means, Marcus and Jennifer convinced themselves that their debt was an investment in their future that would pay off once they achieved the financial success they both believed they deserved. Marcus's first job after college was as a sales representative for Cloud Tech Solutions, a software company that provided customer relationship management systems to small and medium-sized businesses. The position paid $45,000 annually plus commissions. Decent money for an entry-level sales job, but nowhere near enough to support the lifestyle that Marcus and Jennifer wanted to maintain. Jennifer continued working as a real estate agent, but her income was inconsistent and unreliable. During good months, she might earn $5,000 or $6,000 in commissions. During slow periods, she might earn nothing for weeks at a time. This unpredictability made it impossible to budget effectively or plan for major expenses. Rather than adjusting their lifestyle to match their actual income, Marcus and Jennifer decided to use credit cards to smooth out the inconsistencies in their earnings. When Jennifer had a good month, they would make larger payments on their credit cards. When she had a slow period, they would use credit to maintain their spending levels while waiting for her next commission. This strategy might have worked if they had maintained modest spending levels and focused on paying down their existing debt. Instead, they used their occasional high-income months to justify increasing their spending permanently, assuming that Jennifer's peak earnings represented their normal income rather than occasional windfalls that needed to be saved for slower periods. By 2010, 2 years after their wedding, Marcus and Jennifer had accumulated over $60,000 in combined debt while building no savings and acquiring no assets of significant value. Their apartment was filled with expensive furniture purchased on credit, their closets contained designer clothing they couldn't afford, and their social lives revolved around restaurants, entertainment, and activities that consumed every dollar they earned, plus substantial amounts they borrowed. But rather than recognizing that their financial problems were the result of their spending habits, Marcus and Jennifer convinced themselves that they simply needed to increase their income to match their lifestyle. Marcus began looking for sales positions with higher base salaries and better commission structures. Jennifer focused on pursuing higher-end real estate clients who might generate larger commissions per transaction. These career strategies were not inherently problematic, but Marcus and Jennifer's approach to implementing them revealed the fundamental character flaws that would eventually lead them to plan my murder. Rather than developing the skills and expertise that would justify higher compensation, they focused on creating the appearance of success that they believed would attract better opportunities. Marcus leased a BMW that he couldn't afford because he thought luxury car would make him more credible to potential clients. Jennifer invested in expensive clothing and accessories because she believed that looking wealthy was essential to attracting wealthy real estate customers. They moved to a larger, more expensive apartment in a prestigious neighborhood because they thought their address would enhance their professional reputations. Each of these decisions increased their monthly expenses while providing no real improvement in their ability to earn money. The BMW payment consumed money that could have been used to pay down debt. The expensive clothing reduced Jennifer's net income from successful sales. The upgraded apartment required them to use credit cards for basic living expenses during slow income periods. But Marcus and Jennifer interpreted their increasing debt as evidence that they were making smart investments in their futures, rather than recognizing it as proof that their approach to money management was fundamentally flawed. They had convinced themselves that spending money they didn't have was a necessary strategy for making money they wanted to earn. This delusion became more dangerous in 2012, when Jennifer's parents helped them purchase their house in Westfield Heights. The Walsh family had intended their financial assistance to help Marcus and Jennifer build equity and establish financial stability. Instead, the house became the foundation for even more elaborate financial irresponsibility. The house required a down payment of $40,000, money that Marcus and Jennifer didn't have. Jennifer's parents provided $30,000 as a wedding gift, and I contributed $10,000 from my retirement savings. But the house also required closing costs, moving expenses, and immediate repairs that Marcus and Jennifer funded with credit cards and personal loans. More significantly, the house payment consumed nearly 60% of Marcus's base salary, leaving them dependent on Jennifer's unpredictable real estate commissions for all other living expenses. This arrangement might have been manageable if they had maintained modest spending levels, but instead they used the house as justification for upgrading their entire lifestyle. They furnished the house with expensive pieces purchased on credit. They landscaped the yard with premium plants and materials they couldn't afford. They joined the country club associated with their neighborhood because they thought the membership would help Jennifer's real estate business. Each of these decisions increased their monthly expenses while providing no additional income. By 2015, Marcus and Jennifer were spending approximately $8,000 per month while earning an average of $6,500. The $1,500 monthly deficit was being covered by credit cards, personal loans, and occasional financial assistance from family members who didn't understand the full scope of their financial irresponsibility. But rather than recognizing their situation as unsustainable, Marcus and Jennifer convinced themselves that they were experiencing temporary cash flow problems that would be solved by career advancement, market improvements, or other external changes beyond their control. They never acknowledged that their problems were the result of choices they had made and continued to make every day. This denial became more sophisticated as their debt grew larger and their financial situation became more desperate. They developed elaborate justifications for every purchase, every loan, and every request for family assistance. Their expensive clothes were, quote, professional investments. Their luxury cars were, quote, business necessities. Their social activities were networking opportunities. Most importantly, they began to view other people's money as solutions to their problems, rather than recognizing that their problems were caused by their own inability to live within their means. When I helped them with emergency expenses, they saw it as evidence that I had money available to solve their problems, rather than understanding that I was making sacrifices to help them during temporary crises. This attitude toward other people's financial resources was the foundation of their eventual decision to murder me for my inheritance. By 2018, Marcus and Jennifer had become so accustomed to using external sources of money to solve their self-created problems that they began to view my death as simply another potential solution to their financial difficulties. They had transformed from struggling young adults into calculating criminals through 15 years of increasingly unethical choices, each one making the next betrayal easier to justify. And now they were about to discover that targeting someone with my professional background was the biggest mistake they could possibly make. To understand the full magnitude of Marcus and Jennifer's betrayal, you need to understand the 35 years of love, sacrifice, and unwavering support that I had given them. The history that should have made their plan to murder me unthinkable rather than inevitable. Because what made their crimes so devastating wasn't just their willingness to kill me for money, but their complete disregard for everything I had done to build their lives, support their dreams, and create the opportunities that they were now using to plan my destruction. The foundation of my relationship with Marcus was built during those early years when it was just the two of us against the world. From the moment his father abandoned us when Marcus was 3 months old, I had made a promise to myself that my son would never feel unloved, unsupported, or limited by the circumstances of his birth. Every decision I made, every sacrifice I endured, every opportunity I pursued was filtered through one simple question: what would be best for Marcus? This commitment shaped every aspect of our lives during his childhood and adolescence. When Marcus was 2 years old, and I was working 3 jobs just to pay rent and childcare, I would come home exhausted and discouraged, but I would still spend an hour reading to him every night because I understood that early childhood education was crucial for his future success. When he was 5 and wanted to play soccer with his friends, I worked extra shifts to pay for league fees, equipment, and transportation to games, even though the additional work meant I was getting only 4 hours of sleep per night. During Marcus's elementary school years, I made countless small sacrifices that he never knew about but that were essential to creating the stable, nurturing environment he needed to thrive. I wore the same winter coat for 8 years so that Marcus could have new clothes each school year. I drove a car that broke down regularly because maintaining it was cheaper than buying a newer one, and every dollar I saved on transportation could be invested in Marcus's education and activities. When Marcus expressed interest in learning to play piano in 3rd grade, I rearranged our entire budget to pay for lessons, even though it meant eating generic cereal for breakfast and skipping lunch most days to make the numbers work. When he wanted to join the school's academic competition team in 5th grade, I took on additional freelance bookkeeping work to cover the travel expenses for tournaments, working late into the night after Marcus was asleep so that I could earn the extra money without taking time away from our evenings together. But perhaps the most significant sacrifice I made during Marcus's childhood was the decision to remain single throughout his youth. I had several opportunities to develop serious relationships with men who were kind, stable, and genuinely interested in building a life with me and Marcus. But each time a relationship reached the point where marriage became a possibility, I found myself choosing Marcus's needs over my own desire for companionship and partnership. This wasn't because the men I dated were unkind to Marcus or because I thought marriage would automatically harm him. It was because I understood that introducing a stepfather into our family dynamic would inevitably change the close relationship that Marcus and I had built, and I wasn't willing to risk disrupting the stability and security that had taken years to establish. Looking back, I realized that this decision may have inadvertently contributed to Marcus's sense of entitlement and his assumption that my life should revolve around meeting his needs. By consistently prioritizing his welfare over my own happiness, I may have taught him that other people's sacrifices were simply the natural order of things, rather than generous gifts that deserved gratitude and reciprocation. But at the time, these choices felt not just appropriate, but essential. Marcus was thriving academically and socially, and I attributed much of his success to the consistency and stability that our close relationship provided. He was a bright, curious child who loved learning, respected his teachers, and maintained friendships with children from diverse backgrounds and family situations. During his middle school years, Marcus began to show the intelligence and ambition that would eventually earn him admission to a prestigious university. He excelled in mathematics and science, participated in advanced academic programs, and demonstrated leadership skills that impressed his teachers and coaches. I was proud of his achievements and optimistic about his future prospects. It was during this period that I began making even more significant financial sacrifices to ensure that Marcus would have every opportunity to develop his potential. I enrolled him in a summer enrichment program for gifted students. Even though the cost was equivalent to 2 months of our rent, I hired a private tutor to help him prepare for high school entrance exams, working overtime for 3 months to cover the tutoring fees. Most significantly, I began researching colleges and universities, trying to understand what Marcus would need to do during high school to earn admission to the best possible programs. This research revealed that college costs were rising much faster than my income, and that even with scholarships and financial aid, I would need to save substantial amounts of money to help Marcus avoid graduating with crushing student loan debt. This realization led me to make one of the most important financial decisions of my life. I decided to invest more aggressively in building wealth that could support Marcus's education and early career development. Rather than simply saving money in low-interest accounts, I began working with financial advisors to develop investment strategies that could help my money grow faster, while still protecting the principal amounts that Marcus would need for college. This decision required me to become much more knowledgeable about personal finance and investment principles than I had ever needed to be before. I spent evenings and weekends studying investment options, reading financial publications, and consulting with professionals who could help me make informed decisions about Marcus's future. The investment strategy I developed was conservative but steady, focusing on diversified portfolios that could provide consistent growth over the 15-year period before Marcus would start college. I also began contributing more aggressively to retirement accounts that could serve as backup resources if Marcus's educational costs exceeded my other savings. But these financial preparations were only part of my efforts to support Marcus's future success. I also invested significant time and energy in helping him develop the character traits and life skills that would serve him well in college and beyond. We had regular conversations about ethics, responsibility, and the importance of treating other people with respect and kindness. I tried to teach Marcus about gratitude by involving him in volunteer activities where he could see how fortunate he was compared to children who faced more serious challenges. We served meals at homeless shelters during holidays, participated in clothing drives for families in need, and volunteered at community events that brought together people from different economic backgrounds. These experiences seemed to have a positive impact on Marcus during his early teenage years. He was thoughtful about other people's situations, generous with his time and attention when friends needed help, and appreciative of the opportunities that were available to him. I was optimistic that he was developing into the kind of person who would use his intelligence and advantages to make positive contributions to his community. During Marcus's high school years, my sacrifices became even more extensive as I tried to ensure that he would be competitive for admission to elite universities. I paid for SAT preparation courses, college application consulting, and advanced academic programs that were designed to help high-achieving students maximize their potential. But it was also during this period that I began to notice troubling changes in Marcus's attitude and behavior. The gratitude and appreciation that had characterized his younger years were gradually being replaced by assumptions and expectations that I found concerning. Marcus began to take for granted that I would pay for whatever he needed or wanted, without considering whether we could actually afford it or what sacrifices might be required on my part. He would announce plans for expensive activities or purchases, as if my approval and financial support were automatic, becoming genuinely surprised and resentful when I explained that certain things were beyond our budget. More troubling, Marcus began to express embarrassment about our modest lifestyle when it was compared to those of his wealthier classmates. He would make critical comments about our apartment, our car, and my wardrobe, suggesting that these things reflected negatively on him and limited his social opportunities. These attitudes reached a crisis point during Marcus's senior year, when he began dating Jennifer Walsh, and was exposed to a level of wealth and privilege that made our lifestyle seem inadequate by comparison. Rather than appreciating the sacrifices that had enabled him to attend the same school and participate in the same activities as children from much wealthier families, Marcus began to resent the fact that he couldn't match their spending power in all areas. The tension between Marcus's expectations and our financial reality became particularly acute when Jennifer's family invited him to join them for expensive social activities and vacations that were completely beyond our means. Rather than declining these invitations gracefully or finding ways to reciprocate within our budget, Marcus became angry that I couldn't simply write checks to match the Walsh family's generosity. This was when I realized that my efforts to protect Marcus from financial stress had inadvertently prevented him from developing realistic expectations about money and appropriate gratitude for the opportunities he had received. By working so hard to ensure that he never felt deprived or limited, I had failed to teach him that comfort and opportunity were gifts that required appreciation rather than rights that he could demand. But despite these concerning developments in Marcus's attitude, I continued to support his goals and aspirations because I believed that education and maturity would eventually help him develop better perspective about money and relationships. When he was accepted to State University with partial scholarships that would cover about 60% of his costs, I was proud of his achievements and committed to finding ways to help him graduate without excessive debt. The financial planning I had done throughout Marcus's childhood made it possible for me to support his college education without borrowing money or depleting my retirement savings. The investments I had made were performing well, and my income had increased substantially as I advanced in my career with the FBI. I was able to provide Marcus with enough financial support to cover his remaining college costs while still maintaining my own financial security. But Marcus's college years revealed that his attitude problems were getting worse rather than better. Instead of appreciating the financial support that made his education possible, he seemed to view it as the minimum acceptable level of parental responsibility. He regularly requested additional money for activities, travel, and purchases that went far beyond basic educational expenses, becoming resentful when I suggested that he might need to earn some of his own spending money through part-time work. More concerning, Marcus began to make assumptions about my financial situation that were based more on wishful thinking than actual knowledge. He would make comments suggesting that I was being unnecessarily frugal or that I could easily afford larger expenditures if I were simply willing to spend money more freely. These assumptions revealed that Marcus had never bothered to understand the relationship between earning money and spending money, or to appreciate the years of careful planning and sacrifice that had made his comfortable lifestyle possible. In his mind, financial security was simply something that existed, rather than something that had to be created and maintained through consistent effort and intelligent decision-making. When Marcus graduated from college and began his career, I was hopeful that the experience of earning his own money would help him develop more realistic attitudes about finances and more appreciation for the support he had received. Instead, his early career experiences seemed to reinforce his belief that financial problems could be solved by external resources, rather than changes in spending behavior. Marcus's decision to marry Jennifer in 2008 was particularly concerning because it was clear that neither of them understood how to live within their means or how to build wealth over time. Their wedding expenses, housing choices, and lifestyle decisions were all based on what they wanted rather than what they could afford, and they seemed to assume that their financial problems would somehow resolve themselves without significant changes in their behavior. Over the 10 years following Marcus's marriage, I watched helplessly as he and Jennifer made increasingly poor financial decisions while refusing to acknowledge that their problems were self-created. Every time I tried to offer gentle guidance about budgeting, saving, or living within their means, they would become defensive and resentful, suggesting that my advice was outdated or irrelevant to their situation. But despite my growing concerns about their financial irresponsibility, I continued to help Marcus and Jennifer during emergencies, because I couldn't bear the thought of my son and his family facing serious hardship if I had the resources to help them. When their car needed major repairs, I paid for them. When they fell behind on their mortgage during a slow period in Jennifer's real estate business, I helped them catch up. When Marcus needed expensive dental work that wasn't covered by insurance, I covered the costs. Each time I provided this assistance, I would explain that it was emergency help rather than ongoing support, and I would encourage them to develop better financial habits that would prevent similar crises in the future. But Marcus and Jennifer seemed to interpret my help as evidence that I had unlimited resources available to solve their problems, rather than understanding that I was making sacrifices to help them during temporary difficulties. This pattern of financial rescue created a dangerous dynamic where Marcus and Jennifer began to view my money as a solution to their self-created problems, rather than recognizing that their problems required changes in their own behavior. Over time, they became increasingly comfortable asking for help and increasingly resentful when I suggested that they might need to address the underlying causes of their financial stress. By 2018, I had provided Marcus and Jennifer with over $40,000 in emergency assistance over the course of their marriage, money that had been intended to help them through temporary crises, but that had actually enabled them to avoid confronting the fundamental problems with their approach to money management. But what was most troubling wasn't the amount of money I had provided. It was the attitude that Marcus and Jennifer had developed toward my assistance. Rather than expressing gratitude for help that had prevented serious consequences for their poor decisions, they seemed to view my support as something they deserved, rather than something they should appreciate. More concerning, they had begun to make comments and ask questions that suggested they were thinking about my money as a resource that would eventually become available to solve their problems permanently. They would bring up my estate planning and my retirement security in ways that seemed designed to gather information about my assets rather than to express genuine concern about my welfare. These conversations always made me uncomfortable because I recognized the pattern from my professional experience with financial crimes involving family members. The questions Marcus and Jennifer were asking were similar to those asked by adult children who were evaluating elderly parents as potential sources of money, rather than as people deserving of respect and care. But I tried to convince myself that my concerns were unfounded, because I couldn't imagine that my own son, the child I had loved, supported, and sacrificed for throughout his entire life, could be capable of viewing me primarily as a financial resource, rather than as his mother, who deserved his love and protection. This willful blindness to the warning signs was perhaps my biggest mistake during this period. My professional training had taught me to recognize predatory behavior and financial manipulation, but my emotional investment in Marcus made it difficult to apply that knowledge to my own family situation. I wanted to believe that the love and sacrifice I had invested in Marcus's life had created a bond that would protect me from the kind of betrayal I had seen in countless professional cases. I wanted to trust that the values I had tried to teach him about gratitude, responsibility, and treating other people with respect had taken root despite the concerning attitudes he had developed about money and entitlement. But Marcus and Jennifer were operating according to different values that prioritized their immediate comfort and social status over loyalty, gratitude, or basic human decency. The 35 years of love and sacrifice I had invested in Marcus's life meant nothing to them compared to the immediate financial relief that my death would provide. They had calculated that my inheritance would solve their debt problems and provide them with the financial security they had been unable to create through their own efforts. In their minds, the fact that I was 70 years old meant that my death was inevitable anyway, so accelerating the timeline was simply a matter of practical planning rather than murder. What Marcus and Jennifer didn't understand was that their plan to kill me wasn't just a crime against my person. It was a betrayal of every sacrifice I had made, every opportunity I had created, and every moment of love I had invested in building their lives. They were planning to destroy the very person who had made their existence possible, and they were doing it for money that they could have earned through honest work if they had been willing to live within their means. But perhaps most tragically, Marcus and Jennifer's plan would also destroy the legacy I had hoped to leave through my son's life and character. I had invested 35 years in trying to raise someone who would make positive contributions to the world, who would treat other people with kindness and respect, and who would understand that true success was measured by what you gave rather than what you took. Instead, I had apparently raised someone who was willing to murder his own mother for money, someone who saw elderly family members as obstacles to be eliminated rather than people to be cherished and protected. This realization was more devastating than any physical threat they posed, because it meant that my life's most important work, raising Marcus to be a good person, had been a complete failure. But while Marcus and Jennifer were busy planning my murder, I was planning something else entirely. I was going to ensure that their betrayal of 35 years of love and sacrifice would result in consequences so severe that they would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider treating elderly family members as financial resources rather than human beings deserving of respect and protection. They thought they could murder me and inherit my money without facing any consequences for their crimes. They were about to discover that targeting someone with my professional background and personal commitment to justice was the biggest mistake they could possibly make. And I was going to make sure that when they finally understood what they had lost by betraying the woman who had given them everything, the knowledge would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Once I understood that Marcus and Jennifer were planning my murder, every instinct from my 40-year career in forensic investigation kicked into high gear. But this wasn't just another case. This was personal, and I was going to make sure that their betrayal resulted in consequences so devastating that they would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider targeting elderly family members for financial gain. The first step was to establish comprehensive surveillance and documentation systems that would capture every aspect of their criminal planning without alerting them to my knowledge of their intentions. Drawing on techniques I had learned during decades of FBI investigations, I began installing recording equipment throughout my house, focusing particularly on areas where Marcus and Jennifer felt comfortable speaking freely. I purchased micro-recording devices online, using techniques I had learned for tracking financial crimes to ensure that my purchases couldn't be traced back to me. The equipment was sophisticated enough to capture clear audio from anywhere in my house, but small enough to be concealed in everyday objects like picture frames, books, and decorative items that Marcus and Jennifer would never think to examine. The basement became the primary focus of my surveillance setup, since that was where they were planning to stage my accident. I installed multiple recording devices that would capture any conversations they had while examining the stairs, testing scenarios, or discussing their plans. I also set up motion-activated cameras that would document any time they visited the basement when they thought I wasn't aware of their presence. But the most important part of my surveillance strategy was psychological rather than technological. I needed Marcus and Jennifer to feel confident and comfortable enough to continue revealing their plans while I documented everything they said and did. This meant maintaining the appearance of being the vulnerable, trusting elderly woman they needed me to be, while actually conducting the most important investigation of my career. During the 7th week of my recovery, I began implementing what I call controlled vulnerability, deliberately creating opportunities for Marcus and Jennifer to discuss their plans while I appeared to be unaware of their conversations. I would pretend to nap while they were in my house, giving them privacy to talk freely. I would ask them to help with tasks in the basement, providing them with opportunities to examine the stairs and plan their method. Most importantly, I began asking questions that would encourage them to reveal more details about their intentions, while appearing to be simply an elderly woman making conversation about practical concerns. "I've been thinking about what you said about the dangers of living alone," I told Jennifer during one of their visits. "Do you really think I should be worried about having another fall?" Jennifer's response was carefully calculated to increase my anxiety while gathering information about my habits and routines. "Margaret, at your age, falls can be really serious. And the fact that you spend so much time in the basement organizing those old files makes me nervous. Those stairs are just so steep and narrow." Marcus added, "Mom, we're just worried because you're so independent. You don't like to ask for help?" And you do things like carrying heavy boxes up and down those stairs when you should probably ask someone younger to help you. These conversations served multiple purposes from my perspective. They encouraged Marcus and Jennifer to continue revealing their planning while I appeared to be a concerned elderly woman seeking their guidance. They also provided me with recorded evidence of their attempts to manipulate my behavior and increase my anxiety about living independently. But most importantly, these conversations revealed that Marcus and Jennifer were operating under several critical misunderstandings that would ultimately contribute to their downfall. First, they assumed that I was financially vulnerable and that my death would result in a modest inheritance that would solve their immediate debt problems. They had no idea that my estate was worth over $5 million, or that I had the resources to hire the best legal representation and investigative support available. Second, they assumed that I was socially isolated and that my death would not be scrutinized carefully by people who knew me well. They didn't understand that my 40-year career with the FBI had created a network of professional relationships with law enforcement officials who would take a personal interest in ensuring that any suspicious circumstances surrounding my death were investigated thoroughly. Third, and most critically, they assumed that I was intellectually vulnerable and incapable of recognizing or responding to their manipulation. They had no idea that they were revealing their criminal plans to someone who had spent decades building cases against people exactly like them. During the 8th week of my recovery, Marcus and Jennifer began discussing specific timelines and methods for implementing their plan. These conversations, all of which were being recorded by my surveillance equipment, provided detailed evidence of premeditation that would be crucial for their eventual prosecution. The thing is, we need to be careful about timing, Marcus said during one conversation they thought I couldn't hear. It can't look like we were pressuring her, or that we had anything to gain from an accident. Jennifer agreed, adding, "We should probably wait until she's been living normally for a while after her recovery. That way, if something happens, it will look like a separate incident, rather than a complication from her original fall." They discussed various scenarios for how to create the circumstances that would lead to my accidental death. They talked about ways to ensure that I would be alone in the house when the accident occurred, methods for making sure that I would be carrying something heavy when I fell, and strategies for ensuring that my fall would result in fatal injuries rather than survivable ones. Most chilling, they discussed how to behave after my death to avoid suspicion. They planned to appear devastated and surprised by the accident. They would emphasize my independence and my refusal to accept help with dangerous tasks. They would suggest that the accident was tragic but predictable, given my age and my previous fall. "Everyone who knows Mom will understand that this is exactly the kind of thing that could happen to her," Marcus said during one recorded conversation. "She's always been stubborn about doing things herself, and people will think it's sad but not surprising that her independence finally caught up with her." But while Marcus and Jennifer were planning my murder, I was planning their comprehensive destruction. The evidence I was gathering would not only prove their guilt beyond any reasonable doubt, it would also ensure that they faced the maximum possible penalties for their crimes. Working with contacts I had maintained from my FBI career, I began building a case that would result in federal charges rather than state charges. Elder abuse crimes that cross state lines or involve sophisticated planning could be prosecuted federally, which meant longer sentences and more aggressive prosecution. I also began coordinating with the Financial Crimes Unit to ensure that Marcus and Jennifer's debt problems and their motivation for my murder would be thoroughly documented. Their credit card statements, loan applications, and financial records would demonstrate that they had clear financial incentives for my death, and that they lacked the resources to solve their problems through legal means. But perhaps most importantly, I began working with prosecutors to ensure that Marcus and Jennifer's crimes would be publicized in ways that would serve as deterrents to other potential elder abusers. Their case would become an example of how seriously law enforcement takes crimes against elderly victims, and how severely such crimes are punished when the perpetrators are caught. During the 9th week of my recovery, Marcus and Jennifer made their fatal mistake, believing that they had successfully manipulated me into a state of anxiety and dependence. They decided to accelerate their timeline and create the circumstances for my murder. Jennifer called me on a Wednesday afternoon, explaining that she and Marcus wanted to help me with a big project in the basement that weekend. They had noticed that I still had many heavy boxes of files that needed to be moved and organized, and they wanted to help me complete the work so that I wouldn't be tempted to carry heavy items on the stairs myself. "We know you're feeling much better, Margaret, but we want to make sure you don't push yourself too hard," Jennifer explained. "Why don't we come over Saturday morning and help you move all those boxes? That way, you won't have to worry about carrying anything heavy, and we can get everything organized properly." This offer was designed to accomplish several objectives from their perspective. It would give them access to my house, and specifically to the basement, where they planned to stage my accident. It would provide them with a legitimate reason for being present when the accident occurred, and it would allow them to control the circumstances to ensure that my fall would be fatal rather than survivable. But from my perspective, their offer was a gift. It gave me advance warning of when they planned to attempt my murder, allowing me to prepare comprehensive documentation of their crime. It also provided me with the opportunity to control the circumstances of their arrest, ensuring that they would be caught in the act of attempting to kill me. I accepted their offer enthusiastically, playing the role of the grateful elderly woman who appreciated their help and had no idea what they were actually planning. "That would be wonderful," I told Jennifer. "I've been worried about those heavy boxes, and it will be such a relief to have your help. Should I prepare lunch for you, or would you prefer to go out to eat afterward?" Jennifer's response revealed how confident she was that their plan would succeed. "Oh, don't worry about lunch, Margaret. Let's just focus on getting the work done, and then we can see how everyone feels." The phrase "see how everyone feels" was particularly chilling, because it suggested that Jennifer didn't expect me to be in any condition to have feelings about lunch after their basement project was completed. That evening, I contacted Detective Sarah Williams of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, a former colleague who had worked with me on several complex elder abuse cases during my career. Sarah was now a senior investigator who specialized in crimes against elderly victims, and she understood immediately that Marcus and Jennifer's case could set important precedents for prosecuting family members who targeted elderly relatives for financial gain. "Margaret, based on what you've described, we're looking at multiple federal felonies, including conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, and attempted fraud," Detective Williams explained during our phone conversation. "But we need to catch them in the act to build the strongest possible case." We arranged for surveillance teams to be positioned around my house on Saturday morning, with backup officers ready to intervene the moment Marcus and Jennifer made any move to harm me. The entire basement would be monitored by federal agents using advanced surveillance equipment that would capture everything they said and did. But most importantly, I would be wearing a wire that would record every word of their conversations, providing definitive proof of their criminal intent and their specific plans for my murder. "Margaret, I have to ask you this," Detective Williams said. "Are you sure you want to go through with this operation? We could arrest them based on the evidence you've already gathered, but letting them proceed to the point of attempting murder involves significant personal risk." My answer was immediate and definitive. "Sarah, these two people have spent weeks planning to murder me for money while pretending to care about my welfare. They've betrayed 35 years of love and sacrifice, and they're planning to kill the woman who made their lives possible. I want them to face the maximum possible penalties for their crimes, and that means letting them reveal the full extent of their criminal intent." Friday evening, I made my final preparations for what would be Marcus and Jennifer's last free day. I reviewed all the evidence I had gathered, ensured that my recording equipment was functioning properly, and confirmed that my surveillance team would be in position before Marcus and Jennifer arrived. I also updated my will one final time, ensuring that Marcus and Jennifer would receive nothing from my estate and that my wealth would go to organizations that helped elderly victims of crime and students who wanted to pursue careers in law enforcement. Their attempt to murder me for my inheritance would result in them forfeiting every penny they thought they were going to steal. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, perfect weather for the kind of tragic basement accident that Marcus and Jennifer had been planning. They arrived at my house at 9 o'clock, appearing cheerful and helpful as they greeted me, and began discussing the day's work. "We brought some heavy-duty boxes and packing materials," Marcus explained as they surveyed the basement stairs. "We want to make sure everything is properly organized, and that you won't need to carry anything heavy in the future." Jennifer added, We also thought we should look at those stairs and see if there are any safety improvements we could make, maybe better lighting or a different handrail. But as they examined the basement stairs, their conversation revealed that they weren't planning safety improvements. They were finalizing their murder method. "These stairs are really dangerous," Jennifer said, speaking loudly enough for my hidden recording equipment to capture every word. "If someone fell from the top and hit their head at the bottom, it could easily be fatal." Marcus nodded in agreement, especially for someone Mom's age. "A fall like that could cause a brain injury that would be impossible to survive." Quote, "They spent nearly an hour in the basement, ostensibly organizing boxes but actually positioning themselves and testing scenarios for how my accident would occur. Their conversations, all recorded by federal surveillance equipment, provided detailed evidence of their specific plans and their clear intent to commit murder. But when Marcus finally made his move, pushing me toward the top of the stairs while Jennifer positioned herself to ensure that I would fall in a way that would cause maximum injury, federal agents immediately intervened. "FBI, nobody move," Detective Williams announced as a team of agents surrounded Marcus and Jennifer. "You're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and elder abuse." The look of shock and confusion on Marcus and Jennifer's faces was almost comical. They had been so confident in their plan, so certain that they were dealing with a helpless elderly woman, that they couldn't immediately process what was happening. "What are you talking about?" Marcus stammered. "We were just helping my mother organize her basement." But Detective Williams was already reading them their rights while other agents secured the crime scene and began collecting evidence. "Mr. Sinclair, Ms. Sinclair, you have been under federal surveillance for several weeks. We have extensive recordings of your conversations planning your mother's murder. You are being charged with conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, elder abuse, and fraud." As Marcus and Jennifer were led away in handcuffs, I felt a satisfaction that was deeper and more complete than anything I had experienced during my professional career. Justice wasn't just being served. It was being served to people who had betrayed the most fundamental bonds of family and trust. The trial, when it finally took place 6 months later, was a comprehensive demonstration of how thoroughly Marcus and Jennifer had underestimated their intended victim. The evidence against them filled multiple filing cabinets and included hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, financial documents proving their desperate need for money, and expert testimony about their sophisticated planning and clear criminal intent. Marcus was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Jennifer received 22 years. Both were ordered to pay full restitution for their attempted crimes, though given their financial situation, this was largely symbolic. But the most satisfying aspect of their punishment wasn't the prison sentences. It was the complete destruction of everything they had tried so hard to build and maintain. Their house was foreclosed upon when they couldn't make payments from prison. Their luxury cars were repossessed. Their children, Emma and David, were placed in foster care when no family members were willing or able to take them. The social humiliation was just as complete as the legal consequences. Their wealthy neighbors in Westfield Heights discovered that the successful couple they had envied was actually deeply in debt and willing to commit murder for money. Marcus's colleagues at Cloud Tech Solutions learned that their networking partner was a convicted attempted murderer. Jennifer's spa friends realized that the woman they had assumed was financially secure was actually so desperate that she was willing to kill her mother-in-law rather than adjust her lifestyle. But perhaps the most important outcome was the message that their prosecution sent to other potential elder abusers. The case received extensive media coverage, with prosecutors emphasizing that crimes against elderly family members would be investigated aggressively and punished severely, regardless of the relationships involved. Today, 3 years after their conviction, I'm living peacefully in my own home, running my consulting business, and overseeing the charitable foundation that I established with the money Marcus and Jennifer thought they were going to inherit. The foundation provides support for elderly victims of crime and funds scholarships for students who want to pursue careers in law enforcement. Marcus and Jennifer are serving their sentences at federal facilities, where they have plenty of time to think about the choices that destroyed their lives. According to their prison counselors, they spend most of their time reading business and finance books, apparently trying to understand the wealth they forfeited through their crimes. I don't visit them, and I don't respond to the letters they occasionally send asking for forgiveness and another chance. Some betrayals are too fundamental to overcome, and attempted murder by your own family members is certainly one of them. But I do think about them sometimes, especially when I'm working with young people who face the same financial challenges that Marcus and I once faced. I wonder if things might have been different if I had been less willing to rescue Marcus from the consequences of his poor decisions, if I had taught him to appreciate struggle rather than shielding him from it. The answer, I suspect, is that some people are simply incapable of developing gratitude, integrity, or basic human decency, regardless of how they're raised or what opportunities they're given. Marcus and Jennifer had every advantage I could provide, but they chose to use those advantages to plan the murder of the person who had made them possible. That choice revealed who they really were, and it cost them everything they thought they were entitled to inherit. The most important lesson I learned from this experience isn't about Marcus and Jennifer's failures. It's about the importance of recognizing that family relationships don't automatically create immunity from criminal behavior. When someone chooses to commit serious crimes, they must face appropriate consequences regardless of what relationships are involved. Marcus and Jennifer learned, too late, that underestimating someone based on age and family relationships can be a fatal mistake. They thought they were targeting a vulnerable elderly woman who would be easy to manipulate and eliminate. Instead, they targeted someone who had spent decades learning exactly how to catch criminals and ensure that they faced maximum punishment for their crimes. Today, I'm 73 years old, in excellent health, and surrounded by people who value me for who I am rather than what they think they can take from me. My consulting business continues to thrive, my foundation continues to help deserving students and crime victims, and my wealth continues to grow through careful investment and strategic planning. Marcus and Jennifer are exactly where they chose to be, facing the consequences of betraying someone who had given them everything, and learning that some mistakes cost more than you can ever afford to pay. And me, I'm finally living the life I always deserved. Free, independent, secure, and surrounded by people who understand that the greatest wealth isn't money, it's integrity, gratitude, and the knowledge that you've used your life to make the world a little better than you found it. That's a legacy worth building, and it's a legacy that no one can ever steal from you, no matter how hard they try. The catalyst that transformed Marcus and Jennifer from financially irresponsible relatives into would-be murderers came in the form of what appeared to be a minor household accident in my own home. But what seemed like an innocent fall down my basement stairs was actually the moment when my son and daughter-in-law realized that my death could solve their financial problems, and when they began to see accidents as opportunities rather than tragedies to prevent. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October 2019 when everything changed. I had been in my basement sorting through old files and documents, part of an ongoing project to organize 40 years of professional records that I had accumulated during my FBI career. The basement of my ranch house in Maplewood had become a repository for case files, financial documents, and personal papers that I had been meaning to organize for years, but had never found the time to address systematically. The stairs leading to my basement were steep and narrow, typical of houses built in the 1970s when building codes were less strict about accessibility and safety. I had been up and down those stairs thousands of times over the 25 years I had lived in the house, and I had never had any problems navigating them safely. But on this particular afternoon, carrying a box of heavy files while wearing leather-soled shoes that were slightly damp from the rain, I lost my footing near the top of the stairs and tumbled down the entire flight, landing hard on the concrete floor at the bottom. The fall knocked me unconscious for several minutes, and when I regained awareness, I was lying on the basement floor with intense pain in my left ankle, my right wrist, and my back. I tried to stand up but immediately realized that my ankle was either badly sprained or broken, and that I would need help getting out of the basement and to a hospital for medical treatment. Using my cell phone, I called Marcus at work to explain what had happened and ask him to come help me. His response was immediately concerned and supportive, exactly what I would have expected from a loving son who had just learned that his mother had been injured. "Mom, don't try to move," Marcus said when I described my situation. "I'm leaving work right now and I'll be there in 20 minutes. If the pain gets worse, call an ambulance. Don't worry about anything else. Just focus on staying calm until I get there." Quote, Marcus arrived at my house within 15 minutes, accompanied by Jennifer, who had apparently left her real estate office to help with the emergency. They both seemed genuinely worried about my condition and focused on getting me the medical attention I needed as quickly as possible. Marcus carefully helped me up the basement stairs, supporting most of my weight while Jennifer cleared obstacles from our path and gathered my purse and insurance cards. Jennifer drove us to the emergency room at Mercy General Hospital while Marcus sat in the back seat with me, monitoring my condition and asking periodically whether the pain was getting worse. At the hospital, Marcus and Jennifer were attentive and caring throughout the several hours required for X-rays, examination, and treatment. They spoke with the doctors about my condition, helped me complete paperwork, and made sure I understood the instructions for follow-up care. When we finally returned to my house that evening, they insisted on staying to help me get settled and to ensure I had everything I needed for recovery. The medical diagnosis was better than it could have been. My ankle was severely sprained but not broken. My wrist had a hairline fracture that would heal completely, with proper immobilization. My back was bruised and strained but showed no signs of serious injury. The doctor expected full recovery within 6 to 8 weeks, provided I followed the prescribed treatment plan and avoided putting unnecessary stress on my injured joints. During the first few days after my fall, Marcus and Jennifer were wonderfully supportive. They brought groceries, helped with household tasks I couldn't manage with my injuries, and checked on me daily to make sure I was following the doctor's orders and not experiencing any complications. Jennifer, in particular, seemed to take a genuine interest in my recovery process. She would ask detailed questions about my pain levels, my mobility limitations, and my overall comfort. She helped me organize my medications, reminded me about follow-up appointments, and even researched information about recovery strategies for people in my age group who had experienced similar injuries. Marcus focused more on practical matters, ensuring that I had reliable transportation to medical appointments, that my house was safe for someone with limited mobility, and that I had systems in place to call for help if my condition worsened or if I experienced any emergencies during my recovery. For about 2 weeks, this pattern of genuine care and support continued, and I was touched by how quickly Marcus and Jennifer had responded to my crisis and how thoughtfully they were helping me through a difficult period. Their assistance reminded me of the close family relationships I had always hoped we could maintain, and I was optimistic that my accident might actually strengthen our bonds by giving them opportunities to demonstrate their love and commitment. But around the 3rd week of my recovery, I began to notice subtle changes in their behavior that initially confused me, but that I would later recognize as the beginning of their criminal planning. The first change was in the types of questions they asked about my condition. Instead of focusing on my comfort and recovery progress, Marcus and Jennifer began asking more detailed questions about my long-term prognosis, my ability to live independently, and my thoughts about what might have happened if my fall had been more serious. Jennifer, in particular, seemed fascinated by the mechanics of my accident. She would ask me to describe exactly how I had lost my footing, what factors had contributed to my fall, and whether I thought similar accidents were likely to happen again. She would mention news stories about elderly people who had suffered serious injuries from household accidents, and she would suggest that my fall had been a warning about the dangers of living alone at my age. These conversations made me slightly uncomfortable, but I tried to interpret them charitably. Jennifer was a naturally talkative person who often processed information by discussing it extensively, and Marcus had always been someone who worried about potential problems and wanted to plan for various contingencies. Their questions seemed to reflect concern rather than anything more troubling. But the nature of their questions continued to evolve in ways that seemed increasingly focused on worst-case scenarios rather than positive recovery outcomes. Instead of asking how I was feeling or whether I needed help with specific tasks, they would ask whether I was worried about falling again, whether I felt safe in my house, and whether I had considered what would happen if I suffered a more serious injury in the future. Marcus began making suggestions about home safety modifications that seemed disproportionate to the relatively minor nature of my accident. He thought I should install grab bars throughout the house, replace all my rugs with non-slip surfaces, and consider moving my bedroom to the main floor to avoid using the stairs to my basement. When I explained that these modifications seemed unnecessary for someone who was recovering well from a minor injury, Marcus became insistent that I wasn't taking the risks seriously enough. More concerning, Marcus and Jennifer began discussing my living situation as if my fall had revealed fundamental problems that needed to be addressed immediately. They would mention friends whose elderly parents had moved to assisted living facilities after minor accidents, and they would suggest that my fall was evidence that I might need more support than I had previously acknowledged. "Mom, what if you had been unconscious for longer?" Marcus asked during one of these conversations. "What if you had been seriously injured and couldn't reach your phone? What if this happens again when Jennifer and I are out of town and can't get to you quickly?" These questions seemed designed to create anxiety about scenarios that hadn't actually occurred rather than to address my actual recovery needs. When I pointed out that I had handled the situation appropriately by calling for help and that my injuries were healing well, Marcus and Jennifer seemed frustrated rather than reassured. Jennifer began researching care facilities and retirement communities in our area, bringing me brochures and information packets that highlighted their safety features and emergency response systems. "I'm not saying you need this now," she would explain, "but it's good to know what options are available if your situation changes." But the most troubling development was that Marcus and Jennifer began asking increasingly detailed questions about my financial situation, framed as concerns about my ability to afford future care if my health deteriorated. They wanted to know about my insurance coverage, my savings accounts, and my planning for potential long-term care expenses. "Mom, we need to make sure you're prepared for different scenarios," Marcus explained when I questioned why they needed such detailed information about my finances. "If you need assisted living or in-home care, we want to make sure you can afford quality services without depleting your savings too quickly." These financial discussions revealed that Marcus and Jennifer had some fundamental misunderstandings about my resources and my planning. They seemed to assume that I had limited savings and would quickly become dependent on their financial support if I needed ongoing care. They also seemed to believe that my house and modest lifestyle indicated financial constraints, rather than deliberate choices about how to allocate my resources. When I tried to reassure them that I had adequate resources to handle various care scenarios, they seemed skeptical rather than relieved. Marcus would make comments suggesting that I might be underestimating the costs of quality care, or that I might be overconfident about my financial security. "Mom, I know you've always been careful with money," Marcus said during one conversation, "but healthcare costs are really expensive, especially for people our age. Jennifer and I want to make sure you have realistic expectations about what different options might cost." The phrase "people our age" was particularly revealing, because at 42, Marcus was hardly in a position to speak authoritatively about healthcare costs for 70-year-olds. But his comment suggested that he was already thinking about my future as a series of problems that he and Jennifer would need to manage, rather than as decisions that I was capable of making for myself. During the 4th week of my recovery, these conversations took a more ominous turn when Marcus and Jennifer began discussing specific scenarios where I might not be able to make my own decisions about care. They would bring up news stories about elderly people with dementia or cognitive decline, and they would ask whether I had legal documents in place to ensure that my wishes would be respected if I became incapacitated. "Mom, what happens if you have another fall and suffer a head injury?" Jennifer asked during one visit. "What if you develop dementia or Alzheimer's disease? Who would make decisions about your care if you couldn't make them yourself?" Quote, "When I explained that I had appropriate legal documents in place and that I was in excellent cognitive health with no signs of mental decline, Marcus and Jennifer seemed more interested in the details of my legal arrangements than in my assurances about my current condition. They wanted to know who had power of attorney for my medical and financial decisions, whether I had updated these documents recently, and whether I had discussed my preferences with the people who would be responsible for implementing them. These questions seemed designed to gather information about my legal vulnerabilities, rather than to ensure that my wishes would be respected. But the most chilling moment came during the 5th week of my recovery, when Marcus and Jennifer began discussing my fall as if it had been a preview of future accidents, rather than an isolated incident that was unlikely to be repeated. "Mom, the fact that you fell down those stairs shows that your house might not be as safe as we thought," Marcus said during a conversation that seemed carefully planned. "Those basement stairs are really steep, and if you had hit your head instead of your ankle, this could have been much more serious." Jennifer nodded in agreement and added, "It's scary to think about what might have happened if you had fallen differently, or if you had been carrying something heavier, or if you had been alone for longer before calling for help." They began describing various scenarios where similar accidents could result in much more serious injuries or even death. They seemed particularly focused on head injuries that could result from falls on stairs, and they would mention statistics about how dangerous such accidents were for people in my age group. The reality is that people our age don't recover from serious head injuries the way younger people do, Marcus explained, again using the phrase our age to create a sense of shared vulnerability. If you had a serious fall and hit your head, it could be fatal. These conversations were disturbing because Marcus and Jennifer seemed more interested in discussing the potential for fatal accidents than in preventing them. When I suggested practical safety measures like improving lighting on the basement stairs or installing a handrail, they would agree that these were good ideas, but then return to discussing worst-case scenarios. More troubling, they began asking questions about my house and my daily routines that seemed designed to identify other potential accident risks rather than to eliminate them. They wanted to know about my habits around the house, when I typically went to the basement, and whether I usually told anyone when I was planning to do activities that might be dangerous. "Mom, when you go down to the basement to work on your files, do you usually let anyone know?" Jennifer asked during one conversation. "What if you fell again and no one knew where you were?" These questions revealed that Marcus and Jennifer were thinking about scenarios where I might be injured and unable to call for help, but they were approaching these possibilities as problems to understand rather than risks to prevent. The difference was subtle but significant, and it made me increasingly uncomfortable with the direction our conversations were taking. But it wasn't until the 6th week of my recovery that I realized Marcus and Jennifer weren't just worried about future accidents. They were actively planning them. The realization came during a conversation where they were ostensibly helping me organize the basement files that had been scattered when I fell. As we worked to sort through the papers and documents, Jennifer made a comment that revealed how carefully she had been thinking about the circumstances of my original accident. "It's interesting that you were carrying that heavy box when you fell," Jennifer said while examining the basement stairs. "If someone didn't know you very well, they might think it was careless to carry something so heavy on stairs like these." Marcus added, "Yeah, it's the kind of accident that makes perfect sense when you understand Mom's personality. She's always been independent and determined to do things herself, even when it might be safer to ask for help." The way they discussed my fall, as if it were a case study in how accidents could appear to be the natural result of someone's personality and habits, made me realize that they weren't just worried about future accidents. They were studying the circumstances that could make an accident seem believable and inevitable rather than suspicious. This understanding was confirmed during subsequent conversations where Marcus and Jennifer continued to analyze the details of my fall with the kind of precision that suggested they were trying to understand how to replicate similar circumstances. They would discuss the factors that had contributed to my accident: the wet shoes, the heavy box, the steep stairs, as if they were creating a manual for how elderly people might naturally suffer serious falls. But the most damning evidence came during a conversation I overheard between Marcus and Jennifer while they thought I was napping in my bedroom. They were in my kitchen, speaking in low voices, but the acoustics of my house allowed me to hear their words clearly. "The thing is, everyone knows she's independent and stubborn about doing things herself," Marcus was saying. "If something happened to her in the basement, it would make perfect sense to everyone who knows her." Jennifer's response was even more chilling. And, at her age, with her recent fall, if she had a more serious accident, no one would be surprised, especially if it happened the same way, with the stairs. I realized in that moment that Marcus and Jennifer weren't just worried about my safety, they were planning my murder. They had studied the circumstances of my accidental fall and were now planning to create the circumstances for a fatal accident that would appear to be the natural result of my age, my independence, and my previous injury. The basement stairs that had been the site of my minor accident were going to become the location of my planned murder. Marcus and Jennifer had calculated that if I died from a fall down those same stairs, it would appear to be a tragic but understandable repeat of my earlier accident rather than a deliberate crime. But what Marcus and Jennifer didn't know was that the woman they were planning to murder was someone who had spent 40 years studying criminal behavior, recognizing criminal patterns, and building cases against people who thought they were too smart to get caught. They thought they were dealing with a vulnerable elderly woman who had no idea what they were planning. They were actually targeting someone who understood exactly what they were doing and who had the skills, resources, and connections necessary to ensure that their crimes would result in maximum punishment. The basement stairs that they were planning to use for my murder were about to become the foundation for their own destruction, and I was going to make sure that their plan to kill me for my inheritance would cost them everything they had ever hoped to gain.